Okay, how you going? We are again in the section of the Sermon on the Mount looking at anger and murder. So I'm going to go from memory and then we'll get into what this all means. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment." But I say to you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Anyone who says to a brother or sister, "Raka," will be answerable to the court, and anyone who says, "You fool," will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them. Then, come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are on your way, or your adversary will hand you over to the judge will hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. So, here we are again looking at Jesus' intensifying of the Old Testament commandment not to murder. But before we get into it today, I think it's worth pausing to reflect on how brave and audacious Jesus is to revisit one of the Ten Commandments like this and to add his own teaching to it. Now, the Ten Commandments, these are the only words in Scripture that we know were written by God himself. In Exodus, it says, when the Lord finished speaking to Moses, he gave him the 2 stone tablets of the covenants, the tablet stones inscribed by the finger of God. And so here, Jesus is taking these things that are written by God, and he's putting himself on equal authority to this law. It's like he's putting himself on a level ground with God himself by addressing the law in the way that he does. That's what Jesus is doing in these words. And so at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew records that when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, which was not like the other teachers of the law. Whatever Jesus is doing here, what Jesus is doing here is not something other people were doing. He has an authority that is amazing to people. So let's have a bit of a closer look at what Jesus says. Now, today we are looking at 2 examples that Jesus gives to flesh out what a life that is not spent stewing on anger looks like. Jesus is going to describe a life lived beyond anger and instead a life lived in reconciled relationships with others. So he's got 2 illustrations of this. The first is the story. Jesus begins by saying that reconciled relationships trumps the sacredness of offering a sacrificial gift at the temple. He says, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there, in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them. Then, come and offer your gift. Now, the scene is probably unfamiliar to us because we don't offer gifts at the altar. There is no temple, there is no altar, there is no offerings. But you can imagine the scene in a church setting too. You've turned up to church, and before you join in with the singing and the worshipping, you remember that your brother or sister has something against you. Now, what we're talking about, what kind of thing are we talking about? We're not talking about little theological differences. We're not talking about petty human disagreements. We're, in the context, talking about anger that leads to murder. So the word something that Jesus says here, we must keep our eyes on our brother and sister who is angry towards us because of something that we have done that has offended them. That's the context. But also notice in the scene that you aren't remembering that you have a grievance against someone else when you come to worship. It says that you remember that someone else has a grievance against you. And in such a case, you should be the one who makes the first move toward reconciliation. Now, Jesus is saying that this is a priority because he says in this story that you should leave your gift at the altar and immediately go and be reconciled. Now, this example is describing a relationship between 2 Christians. And how sadly, how often it is the case that there are grievances among spiritual family. But Jesus' little scenario here is highlighting how important it is to be reconciled to them. He says it takes precedence over offering worship at the temple. And I think this is because for Jesus, seeking to be reconciled to someone is worship. Now, it doesn't always feel like that for us when we're in the throes of trying to sort out a dispute, but this is a worshipful thing for Jesus. It is as sacred as a temple offering. So that's the first little scenario. The second little scenario Jesus describes is not among Christians. This is somebody taking you to court. He says, settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. So Jesus' instruction, again, it is settle matters quickly. So he describes a scene of walking alongside the person who you are about to face in a court proceeding. And you're not waiting for the court proceeding before you try to be reconciled to them. You're trying to resolve it before you even arrive. So again, the emphasis is on immediacy. Don't just wait. Don't wait and let it see how the scenario plays out. Because in this scenario, the scenario plays out with you ending up in prison. It's not good. So the encouragement is to, rather than waiting and seeing how it plays out, to take initiative, to seek to be reconciled. Okay, let's draw out some principles from this story that we can live by. The first principle is that we should be self-aware of how we might be impacting other people. Jesus says that in this story, we remember that a brother or sister has something against us. Well, to realize when a brother or sister has something against us, unless they've drawn it to our attention, it requires self-awareness. It requires us to be able to reflect on our own behavior and how the things that we say and the things that we do are impacting other people. It requires some self-awareness. Second takeaway, I think, is that we shouldn't put off reconciliation, even with good reasons. So Jesus describes a story where somebody's in the middle of something. They're at the altar, they're worshiping. But Jesus says that should not stop them from going and seeking to be reconciled. And then he describes a story where they're on their way to a court proceeding, where things are going to play out. But Jesus says that even the fact that things are going to play out should not stop them from seeking to be reconciled quickly. So we shouldn't use justifications to put off reconciliation. And lastly, above all else, Jesus is pointing out here that reconciled relationships is the righteous way of living. So last week he was describing the unrighteous way of life. Murder, anger, insult. Those things are unrighteous because they are not treating people rightly. Here he describes instead the righteous way of life. This is the way of life that takes into consideration the image of God in your Christian brother or sister, or in your neighbor who is taking you to court, and to seeking to be reconciled to them because that is the right way to treat them. That is what righteousness is. So today, who can you say sorry to? Who can you check in on to make sure that they don't have anything against you? What can you make the first steps? Who can you make the first steps of reconciliation with? Because this is the way of God's kingdom, where we have received reconciliation with God, and now we are conduits of reconciliation in all our relationships.